Hi everyone, and welcome to another G News update. Today I'm just going to cover quickly Barbara's performance on Q&A, the speech delivered by Chris Hipkins at the Labour Party conference, and of course the new policy for doctor loans in order to set up new clinics which are owner-operated in New Zealand by New Zealanders. Well, what a day it was, particularly on Q&A, where Barbara just knocked it out of the park. And I think we'd all agreed that that was something quite special, a bit of a masterclass, really, and something at a different level from what we're used to in recent years when it comes to the expertise of somebody responding to questions about the books in the finance portfolio. We're a bit used to somebody just screeching and blaming and talking at a very high level, as if someone had just really kind of recited stuff off the back of a cornflake packet. But when Barbara got in there and Jack tried the old, routine, trying to kind of say that, look, if Labour are elected, then of course it's going to cost a whole lot more just to balance the books, it soon became apparent that Barbara wasn't going to have any of that. And so let's just have a look at how that interview panned out. I'll just make some comments. First of all, I think there was a kind of a discussion in there really about the macro and economic indicators and whether or not they were going to improve, and the idea that an improving economy was actually bad for a minister, an opposition finance spokesperson. And this was actually very interesting because Barbara actually handled it very smoothly and basically sort of said she wanted improvements in the economy for people, because she wanted people to do better. And so that was actually a great reframing of the way that Jack was trying to actually position things. And then she went on to basically answer the question underlying, his approach, which was basically, sure, okay, it might make it a little bit harder for an opposition finance spokesperson to prevail, because some people might actually be fooled into going over to vote for the coalition of chaos that we've got, should things improve a bit. But the main thing was really that the economy improves for the people, and that just showed her values, and I think everyone appreciated that. There are a number of other really rather interesting moments in that discussion, that the statement basically that behind every one of these economic indicators is a person, and so the person is more important than the number, and how are we experiencing it. So Barbara found herself answering questions along the lines of, if you ask somebody who just lost their job if things are actually coming right and doing better, then the answer would be no. And then when she was asked, well, what about everyone else? She said, well, it's complex, depends upon who you are, obviously. So if you're a farmer who's actually making some short-term gains right now, that's quite different from somebody else that is struggling away and just pedaling away and getting nowhere. So there was a whole level of complexity to answering those kind of questions. Jack was really kind of trying to get in there and use the same old arguments we've seen before. This attack on the CGT, for example, around fairness. Barbara handled that just by saying, hey, look, well, fairness is kind of subjective. It's very much about the eye of the beholder, really, about what's fair. So there are degrees of fairness. And when Jack tried to go there and say, hey, look, is it fair that someone, may actually be taxed on the increase in the asset value based on inflation, when we have income tax brackets being shifted because the drag on, I suppose, those brackets in income tax are driven by inflation. But Barbara was just way ahead and basically kind of came in and said something along the lines of, well, look, they're quite different, income tax and capital gains taxation, tax on capital. So that was one point. Secondly, the way in which, we increase pay and income tax all the time, more so than we do the tax on capital, is not fair either. So, someone making all their money out of capital income is actually not being taxed, and that's not fair. So, kind of like fairness, which way do you do it? So, this was a very narrow capital gains tax, and Jack was trying to make up hypotheticals. I mean, the hypothetical of the century was in there, something along the lines of, look, say you're a pair of parents, you have a son or a daughter, and you just start buying up 20 properties, and then when you die, they inherit it and they don't actually have to pay capital gains tax. Well, Barbara was saying, yes, that's an exemption. She did believe it was fair that people who are parents can actually pass on wealth to their children. And that shut Jack up, didn't it? So she also talked about the different ways in which this is modelled, the way that in the background, this is pretty much no different to things like the Brightline test that we've currently got, the working papers from which it all comes from, and the fact that, how it's calculated, because she actually had very, very strong technical knowledge. It kind of left Jack kind of swimming there. So in the end, Jack moved along from CGTs and fairness and started talking about things like the structural deficit. Well, Barbara was just right there when he asked for the definition of that, and basically she was able to continue to argue that some of the things that the current national government have actually robbed people of, like, how there's 180,000 low-paid women who've actually had pay equity stolen in Budget 25. Well, Jack was trying to use that as a weapon against Labor and sort of coming in and saying, well, like, National aren't going to put that back. They've buggered off with that. So a Labor government, they'll have to find this $12.8 billion. So it's going to cost more to balance the books. And along the same lines, because this government's kind of like shaping up to kind of ignore its climate change obligations to the Paris Accord by not doing anything about adding our nationally determined contributions to the books as a liability. Well, he was going there after Barbara about, well, a Labor government will probably do the right thing by the climate, and therefore, just like with pay equity, doing the right thing, paying women properly and meeting your climate change obligations, well, that's going to cost more. So Labor's going to actually be more expensive when it comes to just balancing the books, just because they're going to do more. They're going to restore things. So that was kind of the premise of Q&A, which seemed a bit wonky, really, don't you think? Trying to make out that doing good things were bad somehow. But Barbara just answered it saying, look, this is Treasury advice. At the time that we get Treasury advice, there'll be a cabinet decision. And then, we will actually let you know how we will respond to that. But the government that's in there now, they are the government. So she would be very interested in hearing what the government's position on this is. And Jack ended up going, oh no, don't you worry about that. We'll actually ask the government this question. We've asked them before. But obviously, he hadn't really got any satisfactory answers there. And it's a big hole because, when you're not actually living up to your obligations around climate change, then, you shouldn't be rewarded by the TV broadcaster for sort of, oh, well, that's great, isn't it? Look, it's going to cost more. You've saved some money by not doing the right thing. And, dragging us all backwards, really, basically by underfunding stuff. So I think on the overall point score, there was a 12 out of 10 performance there by Barbara. She stood up. There was nothing at the end where Jack had really managed to do a gotcha. And I think everyone saw a different level, a kind of a tax lawyer expertise sitting in the chair there answering from a question, each question from the point of view of somebody that really had focused on this material very, very thoroughly for the last 2 years and for many, many years beforehand. And so there wasn't really anything there that shook the timbers, it was all pretty kind of like slow, deliberate, and, knowing. And I think that's pretty obvious. So there was a big positive reaction to Barbara Edmonds, who I think has won a great deal of respect from everybody, especially national voters. They can sort of see that this is a very, very professional person. Christopher Luxon had actually said he would dearly like to have Barbara on his team because she's so much more experienced and professional. But they didn't. And this came down to values, the values of the Labor Party, looking after everyone, not just the few. And that came through again and again. And also hanging on to things and building them for us, investing in ourselves, not just flicking off everything to the closest foreign buyer that wants to buy it all up, but building a better future for New Zealand, by New Zealanders, for New Zealanders. And those are the kind of lines that were coming through. Then we actually saw Chris Hipkins' speech. It was quite a good speech. It kind of covered a lot of things. It kind of really went after the government about how it had made things much worse in the time that it had been there. It had promised to fix the economy. It had promised to fix the cost of living prices. But Chris Hipkins did ask the question, let me ask you, do you feel better off now than you did 2 years ago? Does it cost less at the supermarket or more? Are your bills, your power bills, better off or worse, for example? And the answer really was that things have got worse, and nobody feels a hell of a lot better. I mean, there's a few people, but the majority of people do not feel a lot better than they were a couple of years ago. And that's a telling thing, because Christopher Luxon did promise that he was going to fix the economy and that things were going to trickle back down into your back pockets because of this macroeconomic growth. But Chris Hipkins pointed out in his speech, trickle-down economics do not work, and they never have. So that was another strong point, kind of skipped over by media, that didn't really kind of behave like somebody that was actually supporting the party that was making true statements like this, but more sort of like looking for errors, looking for negativity, looking for some kind of angle, kind of tacitly supporting the current government with a higher level of scrutiny than we normally see for anything from Christopher Luxon, who can basically get away with saying, we and our plan is working, and we brought down inflation, we brought down interest rates, we, the National Party, are friends to monetary policy, so therefore we take credit for inflation not being 7.2, the peak, that it was during COVID, but we won't mention COVID, will we? Or the fact that National agreed to all COVID spending. So yeah, they just passed by. Chris Hipkins' speech, let's get back to that, basically carried on in the manner of somebody talking about universal versus targeted benefits, I think, for people when it came to access to healthcare, to preventative measures rather than after the fact, and how that will cost a lot less. And then he came up to the big policy announcement of the day after talking about how it really is important, if you've got a job and you're working in a family and you lose that job, that it's possible to actually keep a job and keep a person in New Zealand, because we're losing 200 people a day. And he wanted New Zealand to be a place where, people didn't feel like they could travel overseas and never come back. He wanted people to say, I'm coming back because there's a future for me in New Zealand. And this was really about things like the Future Fund, about investing in ourselves, about not selling off the silverware, which is a Vote for National and ACT, just privatizing, deregulating, bringing in the corporates, and driving people away, driving jobs out, driving the ownership out, driving the ownership of assets into the hands of people who don't even live here. And that's kind of the choice. And the whole idea of choice was also very, very strong in Barbara's interactions and interview on Q&A today. It's all about political choices. So this is the case with Labour. They're offering a choice to build a future in New Zealand, and I think everyone can see that, versus the idea of just kind of like pandering to think tank ideology, making things not work by underfunding it, privatizing it all off to your friends, selling it all off overseas, making a short-term buck, and at the same time trying to cover it up, saying we're about long-term stuff, we're about the KiwiSaver thing, but don't worry about those people who cannot afford to pay even the 3% right now. They've got plenty of notice, they'll figure it out. Chris Hipkins finished that speech basically saying, look, we're going to give these low interest loans to people that want to start up their own community-based, owner-operated medical clinics, and that's actually going to be something that particularly is targeting areas where in New Zealand, New Zealanders don't have access to a clinic nearby, where there's kind of remote issues, there's some kind of problem there where there's really just not enough access. And by doing this thing where he provided like interest-free loans for the first 2 years and 10 years to pay it back, this would actually really, really help doctors who were thinking of starting up but couldn't get the initial capital together to actually make those steps. Now, this was approved by various bodies that represent medical practitioners around New Zealand. And even though at G News, a couple of stray anecdotal doctors will come in who are, basically supporting the National Party and say, oh, well, I'm a doctor and nobody agrees around me. Or, kind of Labour will just tax you more and cost more for the middle classes. These people are probably not really representative of these larger groups that Labour have spent time talking to. So Ayesha Viral came in and fronted a press conference afterwards, which I put on G News. And in that, she just talked through the details that the entire 25 million that it would take to actually get the scheme up and running would actually be funded from the capital gains tax. So you can see how this idea worked very well, had been thought through, and basically followed on from the announcement around the capital gains tax, and how all of this funding was being ring-fenced and moved into health. Now, Jack Tame, he tried to raise the point that only 1/6 of New Zealanders really needed access to the doctor because of matters of not being able to afford it. But the argument there was that we're actually all better off if we can all access public health care. And so situations change, and it's simpler and better and wider, and a matter of belief what's good for everybody in society, that we stick with a universal approach, access for everyone. And now that theme came out a lot in Labour's speeches, that this is about everyone, not just the few. And so we're not doing that thing where it's always about Davy Boy's value for money. What we're doing is basically kind of providing a service that everyone can access and getting that built up and building that for the future. So that's always worked before, and I think it can actually continue to work now. Dr. Ayesha Viral also talked about how there was this very small chance that somebody wouldn't be able to meet their obligations. So, the press were picking over it. We did see this whole policy become the #1 lead story on One News tonight, and Jason Walls fronted that. And basically, I have to say it was a reasonably positive and good explanation of the policy. And we're starting to see this kind of surge and change in the momentum and the mood, while the Labour Party makes all the action. They seem to have what's, termed the momentum right now in all of the political headlines. I think the press have sort of moved on from thinking of National as a long-term government, and I think they're sort of treating them like, the odds are not very good. Jason Walls did mention that Phil Goff had sort of said things were in a balance right now, and he wanted to kind of like hang on to that, it seemed, as if, it was clutching a straw. But I think the momentum's gone red. I see red. The swelling, the rising, the momentum behind this Labour conference was kind of very noticeable to everyone. Belief has moved. Doubt has moved over to National. National seem to be making things worse with every single thing that they do. Simeon Brown really didn't have anything much to say. The main objections that you're starting to hear from people are the lame ones that have already been kind of traversed many times. So you'll hear sort of people generally sort of middle-aged male National Party supporters coming in and saying things like, but where are these doctors going to come from? Where's all the doctors going to come from? Where's all the doctors going to come from? But, this has been asked and answered many times, so it gets a bit tiring, especially when they don't spell things properly. And the answer is basically that when it comes to Labour Party policy, that whole thing about workforce was answered, that it's coming next year, that the workforce planning work has been done, and there were answers around the fact that right now there's a whole lot of medical students and doctors that are now coming through that were actually put into place when Labour last expanded the number of people that were actually coming through as doctors in New Zealand. So these questions have been answered, but they will be continued to be asked by the same group of people who run around the internet trying to create doubt. But right now, things are very strong over in the Labour camp. And as you can see, the light's kind of gone out behind me as the sun goes down. So that's a good sign that basically this is probably enough for 1G News Update. But what a great day. Barbara shone. Chris Hipkins' speech was good. The policy was rock solid. There were no real problems with it. Jack wasn't able to find any kind of gotchas with the old tired, Labour's going to cost you more somehow rhetoric. And I think the thing is that when it comes to wasteful spending, that's a myth that's really been kind of created very strongly by National by leaving out the pandemic as the root cause of greater spending in all countries around the world, just picking on that in New Zealand, constantly leaving it out of their rhetoric, nobody in the press challenging them about, the fact that they signed up for all that COVID spending. So when they talk about 66 billion, a lot of these kind of things were done by a Reserve Bank, not the government itself. The Reserve Bank is independent of government. The Reserve Bank brought down inflation. It was 5.6% when National took over. They've got it down around about 2.25%, I think, something like that when it came to the OCR anyway. And inflation is floating around about 3%, possibly going to come down a little bit soon. So what we're saying here is that it was the Reserve Bank, it was monetary policy, and Christopher Luxon and nobody in the National Party can actually say, we brought it down by this many percent, because basically they didn't. They've kind of just been cutting away at things and reprioritising it into landlords, reprioritising it into big tobacco and big oil. So, you've got all this money going over to these fossil fuel companies drilling, and it's just bad policy. So this is the kind of choices that we'll be making. All of that money that Jack Tame never mentioned, but Barbara did, will be looked at in the books, and we will see after the government does its next budget and the preview next year comes out, Labor's fiscal plan, because it'll all come together. And I think it's very, very reasonable that Labor keep telling the media that they just have to wait. Same with the workforce around the doctors stuff. And, basically the media need to stop playing the game of Labor. Only Labor needs to give us all of their policies and all their fiscal plans and have all their answers today. When they're not doing that to National, are they? So it's very, very one-sided. There's no questions about when National will have all of its fiscal plans. When's it going to have its policy on workforce? When's it going to have everything in place for the next election? So that one-sidedness is corporate media bias, and it should be called out, and I'll call it out. So that was all I wanted to talk about today. What a great day. Barbara, Chris Hipkins' speech, and the new policy for loans for setting up a doctor's clinic in places where it's actually a bit hard to get access, and the way that it helps us all. That's all. Have a great night, and I'll talk to you all again soon.
Welcome to G News, the good news.